No, that's not the Brian Lehrer Show theme, obviously. It's Beethoven music from the only opera he ever wrote. But here's the thing. The main lyric from that scene are the first words in a new book called Republic of Love, Opera and Political Freedom by University of Chicago Law and Ethics professor Martha C. Nussbaum. The words from Fidelio that we were hearing, or at least that are in that movement, as translated into English are, "Oh, what a delight to draw breath in free air. Only here, only, is life." I'll read it again. "Oh, what a delight to draw breath in free air. Only here, only, is life." The context is that Beethoven was writing about imprisonment, the conditions of incarceration, relevant 200 years ago and, of course, relevant today. The characters who sing that section are called the prisoner's chorus. Oh, what a delight to draw breath in free air. So whether Timothy Chalamet is right or wrong that hardly anyone cares about opera or ballet anymore, Professor Nussbaum has this compelling new book about opera's relevance to political freedom. We will also sample clips from Mozart and John Adams operas as we go. University of Chicago Law and Ethics professor Martha C. Nussbaum has written many other books that touch politics and philosophy, with titles like The Fragility of Goodness, and one she was on the show for a few years ago called The Monarchy of Fear. A philosopher looks at our political crisis. Now she's back for Republic of Love, Opera and Political Freedom. Professor Nussbaum, thanks for coming on. Welcome back to WNYC.
Well, hi, Brian. Thank you so much for having me on. And thank you for playing that wonderful extract.
And we're going to hear a little Mozart, and we're going to hear a little John Adams as we go. But the first thing people will see when they open the book, even before the table of contents, is that line from Fidelio. Why lead with that?
Well, because what I'm talking about is the connection of a whole series of operas to debates about political freedom and the importance of cultivating emotions of love and reciprocity in order to actualize political freedom. And the connection is that the act of singing, the breath itself, is an act of freedom. And so what these prisoners are saying is they were allowed to come out into the courtyard for the first time. And for the first time, they can actually draw breath and then therefore sing. And so I put it up front because that's really what I think not all operas, but the ones I write about are all about, is about the freedom to express yourself.
Was there a political context of imprisonment that interested Beethoven in his time? Fidelio was first performed in 1805, I believe. We know what some of the politics around incarceration are today.
Well, I pair it with, in fact, Jake Heggie's Dead Man Walking, which is about incarceration today. And I think Beethoven's concerns were very similar to the ones that motivated Jake Heggie, namely the horrible conditions of incarceration, the lack of real compelling justification for those conditions, and, of course, the death penalty itself, which is looming in the background of that chorus because the lead character is in a deeper dungeon and he's about to be executed by his enemy. The difference is that it's a private prison and it's a single individual who's responsible for all this. So what Jake Heggie shows is the state itself is doing the imprisoning, and that's something that Beethoven wasn't really conscious of.
We'll get into Mozart, who is central to the book, and come toward the present with John Adams and his opera Nixon in China. But why, in general, Professor Nussbaum, a book about opera's relevance to political thought now in 2026?
Well, I've always been a huge opera fan, and I think all these debates about democracy and Enlightenment thought ignore the emotions for the most part. And I think this is the contribution of opera, that it asks us not just to think the right thoughts, but it asks us to dig into ourselves and cultivate emotions of love and reciprocity. And I think it was Mozart's idea. I mean, he was the first one who had this idea. I think he was a Freemason and he thought a lot about politics. He thought that unless you cultivate love and reciprocity through music, you weren't going to realize these values in the fullest way. And so I follow a series of composers ranging from, indeed, Mozart to Jake Heggie and John Adams, who continue this line of thought.
So Mozart, he composed before Beethoven, that was the 1700s, right. And you write that the Mozartian strand you follow is one associated with the liberal Enlightenment, and that Mozart was a committed man of the Enlightenment. In what ways do you mean that, for example?
Well, I mean that he was part and parcel of a reform spirit in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Joseph II had de-ghettoized the Jews, and he had done lots to limit the dictatorial power of the Catholic Church. So Mozart was part of this reform spirit, but he went further, and he was actually a committed Freemason, which was pretty controversial. And the Freemasons believed that all people, working people, aristocrats, they had to come together. The lodge that he chose for himself was not one that had elites in it. It had really bourgeois people and working people. And it also had racial minorities. And it didn't have women, but he urged that it should be open to women as well. So he was a pretty more radical egalitarian than a lot of the people around him. And he was kind of the court composer of his Freemasonic lodge. They called on him to write various things. And you can trace this not only in his opera, The Magic Flute, which is famously connected to his Freemasonic views, but in lots of the things he wrote. He really believed that people were equal, but to realize that equality, you need the emotions, and you need to be exchanging love with others in a climate of reciprocity.
Hence, to some degree, the name of the book, Republic of Love, Opera and Political Freedom. And here's a short sample from a Mozart opera you write about, The Marriage of Figaro. And so I want to ask you a little bit more about your thought that Mozart was, for his time, I guess, and in the context of his music, a promoter of more gender equality in particular, right?
Yes, and you can trace in The Magic Flute the fact that women are included at every stage. So Pamina, the heroine, takes the lead in the trials that lead to initiation. And the chorus of initiates is scored for both males and females. So these are things, the lodges in France had admitted women. And the thought, I agree with scholars who think that Mozart and his librettist Schikaneder were carrying on that fight within their own lodge, trying to say, you too should admit women as full equals.
And listeners, we might have time for a phone call or two, or a text that I could read for Martha C. Nussbaum on opera and politics. Any opera and politics connectors out there with respect to any opera that you're a fan of, or anything related? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692 if you want to get in on it over the next few minutes. Much closer to the present, you write about the John Adams opera Nixon in China. I'm lucky enough to have seen a performance of that one time. Amazing for the music, amazing for the lyrics, amazing for the beautiful but also sometimes comical, I think it's fair to say, sets and oversized props, like a big airplane replica touching down on stage as if Nixon landing in Beijing. So here's a little from that opera, and then I'll ask you to talk about it.
As a kind of mystery.
Act 1, Scene 1. They call that news has a kind of mystery. If you couldn't quite make out the lyric, news has a kind of mystery. That was a version by Ido de Ward and the Orchestra of St. Luke's. The Mozart excerpt was from Musikalist Leitung, just to give credit where credit is due on those. So, Professor Nussbaum, you write that opera shows how the search for future peace depends on inevitably flawed human beings. Nixon, Zhou Enlai?
Yes, well, this is a theme that runs from the Mozart part on, because Mozart thought we have to find peace and achieve our ideals in the real world with people as they are, and they are, of course, flawed. And so that's why his operas are always mostly comic, that the people are flawed and they make peace through that, actually, and not against it. And so in the second half, I look at various problems in the world that Mozart, dying at the age of 35, had not known about or faced, one of them being the state prison, which I write about. But at the end, I talk about the search for world understanding. And, of course, Mozart had no clue about that. But I think what's great about Adams's opera is that he's exactly my age, and he came of age in the Vietnam War, and they all hated Nixon, and they thought the war was terrible. And he was a draft dodger like everyone else. But he realized later that Nixon had a kind of, the greatness was mixed with the narcissism. And there was this strange mixture, which I think is really true about Nixon, that he really had high ideals, and he was trying to realize them. And in that aria, you hear that, the enthusiasm, the trying to get somewhere. And to get somewhere through actually taking a leap and going there and trying to understand. And this is what WNYC at the end of the opera also does. But at the same time, he's Nixon, and he's vain, and later, shortly after that, he turns paranoid and says the rats are gnawing my sheets. And so these are the real people in the world who have to do the peacemaking.
The rats are gnawing the sheets, and somebody once said, the author Edward C. Herman once said, when John Dean and others were deserting the Nixon administration during Watergate, it's like a rat leaving a sinking rat, which was a funny line at the time.
It was just after. I mean, Watergate was being planned while he was in China. So the good and the bad are contemporaneous, and that's what's so remarkable. And I think the trip to China was actually a great and heroic act, and trying to really do something for the world. WNYC ends the opera, and he sings that he's an old man, but he's looking at the world, and he doesn't really want the world of the Cultural Revolution anymore. He was very flawed. He killed lots of people in the Cultural Revolution. But what he wanted was a world of détente and understanding. And so he and Nixon, both extremely flawed, come together in this search for détente and moving forward for the sake of their people. And the theme of feeding the hungry is a very important feature of that opera.
Seeking détente, maybe not so much for the composer Jimmy in Woodside is calling about. Jimmy, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi. I'd love to hear your guest take on why Hitler loved Wagner's operas, in fact, played them at Nazi rallies.
And why Wagner? I want to read for the listeners a quote from your book about Wagner, that he was asking us to see asking us to see a conservative, xenophobic music culture as a genuine condition for genuine musical art. What?
Yes, I mean, so Wagner comes into the book as the kind of antitype of everything else that the book stands for. And he had to come in because he's the big opponent that everything that Mozart and Beethoven stood for. He thought that art had to be written by an authoritative artist who would lay down the law for what was true German art. Nothing, no foreign influences, no French, no Italian, and of course, as he copiously wrote, no Jewish influences. So Wagner is, I think he had great talent, and certainly his music sometimes compels people. But he was a very sick individual, and he was completely incapable of everything that I talk about, namely of listening to other people, trying to understand them, reciprocity, mutual respect, and so on. So I think that I'm about to teach a course on opera where we'll talk about Die Meistersinger, which is what I write about in the book, namely this ideal community, which is all the rule of one Wagnerian individual, who just says at the end, Hans Sachs, the hero, says, well, beware, There are terrible influences threatening us, these foreign influences. We better keep them at bay and cultivate true, holy German art. And that's what Wagner wanted to do.
Yeah.
He was the only one he trusted. So that's the lesson for us all.
There's that, which unfortunately listeners' heads are bobbing up and down saying, it's
right.
really Wagner rising in the 21st century. Well, now that we've talked about Beethoven, Mozart, John Adams, and Wagner, Desiree in Park Slope is going to close it by raising who else? Timothy Chalamet. Desiree, we've got about 30 seconds for it. Hi.
Okay. So, as I said to the screener, I believe it is an information-seeking behavior of people to consider the opinions of people in their peer group to be the people. And I believe that because people of the age of Timothy Chalamet grew up in an internet culture, they believe that what's on the internet and what they can see on social media is the people.
And I'm going to have to leave it there, Desiree, so we have time for an answer. But,
I think, there's plenty of opera on the internet. It has actually conduced greatly to the spread of opera because you can find YouTube performances all over the place. And my students in my opera class come to opera often through the internet. So I think it cuts both ways.
Was it more of a wide audience art form at any of the times in the past than it is today, though?
I think there were times when it was focused more toward elites. And I think that's still true of some parts, I fear, of the New York opera scene. And I think the growth of opera comes really from the regional companies, the smaller companies. We've never had better young singers than we do now. The education of singers is fantastic. And I've just been listening to a new recording of a Baroque opera that has in it mostly young people of color, Asian, black, and these
the
singers
last
are fantastic.
word. Martha C. Nussbaum, professor at the University of Chicago, author now of Republic of Love, Opera and Political Freedom. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Oh, thank you so much, Brian.
Since WNYC's first broadcast in 1924, we've been dedicated to creating the kind of content we know the world needs. Since then, New York Public Radio's rigorous journalism has gone on to win a Peabody Award and a DuPont Columbia Award, among others. In addition to this award-winning reporting, your sponsorship also supports inspiring storytelling and extraordinary music that is free and accessible to all. To get in touch and find out more, visit sponsorship.wnyc.org.